Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Hello and welcome to the University of Virginia School of Education and Human Development. My name is Ian Callan, and I want to thank you for joining us at our Education Policy Seminar today. This talk is part of the Education Policy Works Seminar Series, sponsored by the Bankert Fund for Political Economy. Each semester, EdPolicyWorks hosts a number of talks from external and internal speakers on a host of education policy and research-related topics. These talks are free and open to the public. Our next speaker will be Dr. Richard Welsh on December 2nd. For more information on EdPolicyWorks and future seminars, please visit our website. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Andrew Simon, an assistant professor of public policy in the Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy at the University of Virginia. Dr. Simon's research focuses on issues in state and local public finance, with a particular interest in higher education finance and policy and employment policy. Before joining us here at UVA, Dr. Simon was a postdoc scholar at the University of Chicago, an Australian National University. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Michigan, where he was an Institute for Education Science pre-doc fellow. Dr. Simon will speak for approximately 1 hour and leave 15 to 30 minutes for questions and discussion out of respect for other meetings that occur following this talk. We encourage you to address any personalized or additional questions for Dr. Simon via email. Once again, thank you for attending today. And without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Simon.
Thank you, everyone, for having me and for this opportunity to share this work. So I'm Andrew Simon. This is joint work with Ruben Hurst and Michael Ricks. This is a project that we started together at the University of Michigan in graduate school. And this project is really going to try to think about the politics of funding higher education and polarization. So I'm going to maybe start off with a little bit of an apology for talking to you about the politics 8 days before an election. But maybe some cautious optimism lingering in the background here. So across a variety of different public services and public funding issues, people think about and inform their ideal levels of public spending by trading off the value of having more and better services. So for example, having higher quality schools with the added costs that they'd have to pay to finance them with added taxes. So I really want to have good schools, but it's going to come at some personal costs, and I may not be willing to have great schools if it's really expensive. But people often very directly attached to their political identity come to strikingly different and polarized conclusions about this. So as the example in higher ed, a recent survey from Pew found that about 2/3 of Democrats compared to only 1/3 of Republicans view higher education positively. That survey was in 2019. I think the rhetoric that has come since 2019 may make us even more worried about that partisan gap and the extent to which it may be growing. And so in this project, we want to think about why is this partisan gap exists and why may it be growing. A lot of people, or the way that we tend to talk about this, focuses on what we call, say, people's preferences. It's just that people have different values in why we may want to have good colleges or good K-12 education. But in this project, we're going to think about sort of a different feature here, which is the role of people's beliefs and reasoning about the return on investment. That is what they think their dollar is going to buy them for having better services. So in part here, in thinking about higher ed, is coming from the economic value of, say, having a more highly educated workforce who are going to contribute to economic growth, sort of other benefits for the economy. In higher ed, there's also other issues that we worry about as driving polarization. I think, again, since 2019, issues of DEI have become quite salient and important in politics that have maybe cast a shadow or overshadowed the role that we may think of these other features. Okay. So this is, of course, important, as I highlighted with we're coming up with the election, as maybe from a rhetoric standpoint, quite important. The ability for us to engage with one another on these issues, even despite our differences. But these issues in polarization of higher ed also seem to be quite important for declining support. And so, or potentially important. And so since the 1980s, steep support for higher education, public higher education, has fallen quite steadily. I've taken this figure from a somewhat recent paper by Sarah Turner and co-authors, and they point out that there's limited evidence on why we're seeing this long run decline. Sort of work before theirs would maybe guess or sort of suggest that part of this is just due to the fact that there are changing priorities in the US where higher education tends to take a backseat. So the way that it's sort of characterized is that the state has a bunch of tax revenue. It's going to figure out what line items it wants to spend on, and then whatever's left after everything else gets put to higher ed. And so increases in, say, the aging population, which more funds towards, say, Medicare or Medicaid, may have contributed to this support. They're going to sort of argue, although not be able to test, another potential concern here, which is that there's a decreased political will from individuals because people believe the return on investment is low. In their case that they sort of are thinking about in particular is the fact that as people choose to leave their state, say I get my education in the University of Virginia, but then I want to go live in California, that has a really low value for the state. I'm going to pay to train this person who's not going to actually be part of my college educated workforce. Why am I doing this? And so these concerns about the return on investment for the state may be really important for driving these. We're going to think about this quite concretely in this paper. And of course, I want to just highlight that these declines have, this paper is really about the cause of these declines, but these declines do have important effects on students and institutions, which is why we care about them. And so in a lot of my work, I think about these effects more specifically. What is this decline and how does this decline that's changed differentially across states mean for students and mean for colleges in those states? Today, we're going to sort of talk about the politics behind this. Please.
To what extent, like I'm thinking about the blue line in particular.
Yeah.
And I am thinking about this in K-12 brain, so you can tell me that it doesn't map on, but like, has the price or the cost of a per FTE enrollment for students remained relatively constant over time?
It has, yeah. So there's two ways that you could think about the cost here. You could think about in higher ed. You could, which is different than K-12 from the standpoint of people pay tuition as part of the subsidy rate or part of the total expenditure. So the cost for the average cost at public colleges and at colleges more broadly has been relatively flat. Sticker prices have increased a lot, and that's where a lot of the discussion is, or let's say the popular rhetoric has come out. But that's because institutions are using more need-based aid. And that's true at public colleges as well. So in the past, like 15 years, public colleges have moved to a slightly higher tuition policy with more need-based aid than they did historically. Although other work by Sarah, not this paper, but with former UVA graduate Emily Cope, found that the increases or decreases in state appropriation don't seem to affect the extent to which they're using need-based aid. The other part is by how much does it cost to educate a student, right? So you have a few margins that you could adjust on. I have less revenue, I can lower quality, I can increase prices, and the costs themselves have also seemed to be relatively flat for educators.
So a similar kind of question, but so in the blue line, which over very long periods of time, it seems like we're just sort of, we're going through peaks and valleys. And up until 2008, it seems to, on average, be, if you drew a regression line there, it'd be fairly constant. It is the Great Recession and the period thereafter that really meaningfully decreases this. And again, I mean, so I'm wondering how much of this is just the very long impact that the Great Recession had and the associated potential change in politics. And the other part of my question is, looking at the appropriations per state and local general revenue, how much of that relates to competing uses like healthcare for those appropriations, which have gotten a lot more costly and perhaps seen as less fungible than higher ed?
Yeah, maybe I should say like this is maybe a red herring of the talk of this is like motivation about the context in which we're going to be talking today. Okay. So I'm going to answer your question. No, I want to answer your questions, but for context, but it's a little tangential to the point of where I think I'm going. So this paper by Sarah and co-authors finds that this decline can only be only almost 20% of it could be attributed to things like Medicaid changes, right? So it's like a fairly small portion, but meaningful. But what's going on with this other 80%? Like what is, I think is the sort of puzzle perhaps in the literature. We don't really have a lot of evidence. People don't seem really interested in this question, which I find this is all I do. It's a lot of what I do. And then, yeah, I think a lot of the talk about post-Great Recession is like post the Great Recession, we've sort of never recovered. I actually think that's true of the 2001 recession. The 2001 recession was a big launching point for this decline. There's a maybe slight uptick right before the Great Recession, but again, sort of like long run, no decline. Overall decline. But I think what I'm going to try to focus you on today is how much of polarization in general and the way people think about this policy process and what it means for their state matters, using the fact that there seems to be something going on in the background in Moore's motivation. Okay. So in this paper, we're going to try to study the drivers and the consequences of polarization of higher education funding. So we're first going to ask, how do the perceptions and reasoning of return on investment contribute to ideological polarization? So this is the difference between Democrats and Republicans and what policies they want to see implemented, as well as affective polarization. So how do they think about forming and communicating those policies? How much of cross-party divide in the way that we talk about these policies is driven by their beliefs about the return. And then we're going to try to understand how much does this matter for policy itself. So how does these elected officials, constituents, ideal policies and expressing them affect their behavior? Please.
So, sorry, just to clarify, what you're thinking of is the causal mechanism here. So you're thinking of the attitudes and perceptions as being the driver for potentially changes in investments and appropriations, or
for the second part.
For the second part.
Yeah. So the way I'm thinking, I mean, this is I wouldn't necessarily put in these words, but if we think about like median voter theorem type, we're gonna have less of a. I don't have a formal model of how I guess I'm specifically thinking about this part, but the idea that I think as an elected official, I'm beholden to my constituents' demands. If I don't implement policies that they want, which is say Medicaid over funding higher education, or say funding other policies over higher education, then I will get voted out of office. So if I learn that my constituents actually really care about funding higher education, or I learn that they really don't care, then that may affect the extent to which I'm willing to fight for those policies. Great. So in this paper, we're going to conduct 3 experiments. The first 2 are going to be field experiments, really survey experiments on individuals' demand or their ideal policies for state funding for higher education. So this is going to allow us to document the nature and extent of polarization across parties, but across other aspects of individuals as well, in how much they want to spend, how much they're willing to give up of, say, their own money in tax revenue to spend on higher education. And then we're going to provide information that's designed to potentially shape, but not definitely shape, their perceptions of return on investment, and see how when we change or provide this information that may change their perception of ROI, how does that affect what policies they want to see? And so we're going to interpret these changes through an economic model to learn about the drivers of polarization, and then to understand how people reason about higher education policy. We're then going to conduct a 3rd experiment with elected officials to understand how they respond to learning about what their constituents actually want on higher education policy. Are they cognizant, or do they care about what their constituents actually want and see implemented? Okay, so I'm going to start with a brief model in words and then pictures. And so as I sort of started the motivation of this talk, we're going to be thinking about people who are thinking about how much they want their state to spend in tax revenue on public higher education. And they're going to, the amount that they need to spend is going to depend on how much they actually want in outputs. If I want a really good higher education system, I have to spend a lot of tax revenue. To help fix ideas, and also as we're going to think about in the experiment that I'll motivate a little bit more later, we're going to think about this like quality metric as just being the graduation rate. So public college graduation rates nationally are about 62%. So they are not incredibly high, and you could think about trying to invest more in that system to bolster your graduation. People are going to have beliefs which are likely or very frequently inaccurate about the level of provision. So what is the graduation rate in my college? Are my state's colleges good, or are they not? And then as well as how much am I spending for us to be able to get to that level of quality? And then they're also going to have from that beliefs about their state's effectiveness. So if I were to spend more money on my state's college, would I get a really good graduation rate? Would I not really affect the graduation rate at all? How does that matter? And so then, yeah, Ben, please.
I'm wondering, Andrew, how much, like, especially among the higher propensity voters who elected officials more likely to care about, how much they see, and I don't know if you'll get this in your experience, how much they believe it's the role of the state versus the role of the individual to pay for college education, particularly if a higher propensity voter is more likely to perhaps consider more selected institutions for their children on average? And you might question that premise. But like how that affects, I might think, I think there's a very high return to investment, but I see that as a private investment. And I have high willingness to pay given the high expected return. And because of that, like I actually don't think this is a necessary area of state investment.
I see. So so I don't know if we have a way in our survey that we've directly gotten at that. We do ask them about their opinions on what they think the effect of additional state revenue is, right? Which is, I think, different than, say, the impact of graduating from college. I will say that there are people who think that the effect is even negative, which is, and I'll talk about how I know this a little bit more later, but from their answers, there's a fair number of people who believe that when you invest more in the system, when the government invests more in the system, students lose skin in the game, and then they won't graduate, and they won't have successful careers. I'm not sure the extent. I haven't collected the data to really answer your question well, is I think the problem, or what I'm struggling with, of what to say here. But I
questions about private institutions. Do you have about that?
No. So we have information on like where or what type of school they went to for college. So we would be able to look at, say, like if you, or the extent to which you believe that you're going to send your kids to a public college versus a private college or no college. But I don't know if we've looked at that heterogeneity. And I'm not exactly even sure the extent to which we have the power to really think about those issues. But I'm happy to return to that as we talk. So given this sort of setup, people are just going to trade off the benefits and the costs, right? And so this is what this looks like in a picture. We have people's perceived benefits from having a higher graduation rate is this downward sloping curve. And it's downward sloping because this is sort of a traditional demand curve with the idea that I would get a really high additional benefit if I move the graduation rate from 30 to 31, and I get a much smaller relative benefit if I move the graduation rate from 90 to 91. And that's why it essentially looks downward sloping. People also have their beliefs about what the costs are, right? Again, it's like maybe not that expensive to move the graduation rate from 30 to 31, but it's really expensive to move it from 90. So you have upward sloping. And so the point, their ideal policy, not in the policy that's actually necessarily put in place, but their ideal policy is the point where these intersect, right? And we just call this G star. I want this graduation rate. I'm willing to spend the requisite number of tax dollars that are given by this marginal cost curve to achieve this specific graduation rate. And a lot of the, say, discussion in the literature is focused on differences in these beliefs about the benefits, how much, say, Republicans care about or think that the state's job is to have a high quality public college with a good graduation rate versus it's on it.
And just for framing, are you going to be, should we be thinking about graduation rate as the
I do, yes.
So why the choice strategically there versus $1,000 increase in average earnings of participants or graduates?
Can I punt on that for a few minutes? Because I have a whole slide on it.
I guess I'm struggling with like the graduation rate thing as well, in the sense that if I were thinking strategically about how to increase graduation rates, I might do something like actually limit supply, because a big margin is who I admit or who I choose to serve. So I'm thinking about like I spend more money. One of the I sort of thinking of a scenario where I increase funding, but a lot of that goes into like expanding access, and the marginal student has a lower sort of likelihood of graduation.
Yeah. So I agree that that's a worry. We explicitly asked them their beliefs on this question. I'd also say it's not in line with the empirical evidence. Like I agree with the idea in principle, but the evidence on the effect of increases in state appropriations on graduation rates is positive, and it's largely coming a little bit through entry, but it's a lot coming through persistence. And there's a lot of students who don't make it to graduation because tuition's high, they're getting access, they're getting on a job that's distracting from their studies, and they're just not able to invest, or it becomes too expensive because the appropriations has a direct effect on tuition, which affects who persists. So in principle agree with the mechanism you're talking about. The average treatment effect from increase in graduation is positive, and then we try to understand the extent to which people may believe this incorrectly.
Okay, so I'm not an economist, so I apologize if this is a very basic question. How does it affect if you have different actors in the system? Like this is on average, right? This is equilibrium on average.
This is a single person's ideal policy, given their perceptions, right? So I'm not talking at all about how I go from each individual to what ends up being implemented. This is just me as a person.
So then individuals can move up and down on
exactly. Yeah. Okay. But so great. The point behind this figure for an individual is a lot of focus across people on what drives polarization. So if you just compared one Democrat and one Republican, or differences in what they think are their benefits, right? Like Republicans just don't necessarily believe as much, or say that they don't believe as much, that we should have high quality institutions. What we're going to focus on instead are what we think are differences in essentially these costs. So a different explanation for why that could drive polarization here and why Democrats may prefer more spending is because they think their state's more productive. They think for every given dollar that they invest, or the state invests, you're going to get a bigger bang for your buck that leads to this figure. And so we want to understand the extent to which maybe this is true, and the extent to which maybe we can fix this by providing information. So let's say that the truth is somewhere in the middle. Can I nudge people in some way by providing them information that's going to be able to correct this and fix polarization? We're going to try to do that. But part of the issue in doing that is I don't know how people are necessarily going to, or we don't know ex ante how people are going to interpret that information. So we're going to provide them information that, let's say, for example, the graduation rate is higher. So we're going to take a Republican and a Democrat with the same exact beliefs, and we're going to tell one of them that, or sorry, we're going to tell both of them that the graduation rate is higher. And they could update in two ways. These are sort of like knife edge cases. People can do something. One way is they could just say, oh, you told me the graduation rate is higher. The state must be spending more, right? The reason why we have a higher graduation rate is because they've invested more money. I was wrong about the graduation rate. I must have been wrong about spending in the exact same way. These are just moving them along these curves. The curves don't change. The points at the intersect don't change. And so there's no change in their ideal policies because they've reasoned from this information in a particular way. They alternatively could say, oh, I don't think spending actually changed at all. My beliefs about spending were correct, but actually the reason the graduation rate is higher is because the state was more cost effective. It was able to take that same money that I thought we had. It's actually using it smarter than I thought. Maybe this is in part coming from I'm changing my beliefs about the nature of the students that enroll. But because of that, the return on investment ends up being higher. And now I'm willing to spend more money, right? I'm choosing the point that I want to spend as where I think like the marginal value of that dollar from the government standpoint is less than it's costing me as a tax. And so the effect of information, the effect of polarization is going to depend on the extent to which people have different beliefs about these costs and benefits. How they respond to this information is going to depend on how they reason from it. And there may be good reason to think that these people who come to different conclusions about the value of public higher education are reasoning about the system. And that's what we're going to test today. Okay, so we're going to do this in a survey experiment, or really two survey experiments. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the first survey experiment and then a little bit on the second. So we're going to recruit a sample of about 4,700 individuals through Qualtrics and Qual Research. We're going to elicit their beliefs about two features of the ROI of their own state. So what do they think the public college graduation rate is as a percent? What do they think this ranks relative to other states? And then we're going to do the same thing on state spending, so appropriations per student in their state. And then we're going to randomize individuals into treatments to try to shape or potentially shape their beliefs about return on investment. So our control group is going to receive no information from us. Our first treatment group, we're going to tell them the public college graduation rate, and then the second treatment is going to tell them both the rate and the rate. The idea here, right, is that if, as I sort of highlighted in the graphs, if your beliefs about the return on investment are a function of both what you think spending is and what you think these outputs are, the graduation rate is an example, then our information can shape your beliefs about return on investment, but it's going to importantly depend on how you think through the process. Our second experiment, we're going to randomize spending beliefs additionally as sort of a test of the potential mechanisms. Okay, so why graduation rates and spending, to Ben's question. So we have three sort of main reasons of why we focused on this. The first is that they reflect the social return on investment in a sort of straightforward way. So conditional on the level of spending, if there are higher graduation rates, this means the state's just better at converting their inputs into outputs. There's less waste in the system. If I spend $10,000 per student and I have a graduation rate of 60%, then the 40% I'm spending $10,000 on, and I'm not necessarily getting my return from having a more college-educated workforce. There's other benefits for like partial enrollment that I'm sort of like abstracting away from here, but I think that's a high-level statement about that point. Versus if I had an 80% graduation rate, then there's only 20% of people that I spent $10,000 on without them actually getting their college degree. And so for this reason, the graduation rate and spending are sort of key components of return. There's also past work that's showing that there is this causal positive link that increases in state appropriations do affect the graduation rate in particular. And then people say that it's a first order concern, both for policymakers. 47 states have codified some sort of goal that essentially is along the lines of by 2030, 60% of our population will have at least a college degree. That's Florida. Florida of all states now, right? And some recent survey evidence also says that taxpayers really care about the graduation rate. They think of this as a nice marker of accountability for the exact waste issue that I showed before. If I'm giving a college tax revenue and then their students are not being successful and they're not getting college degrees, that's a accountability marker. Sort of to Ben's point from before, and then I'll let him ask his second question, his next question, is we also think graduation rates are important because, or nice, because they're bounded between 0 and 100. Everyone sort of understands them. I think as an information piece, they're sort of nice to be able to provide, and they're sort of the first outcome. So a lot of the other things that we thought about as being important, wages, as a characterized economist, we really care about wages when you're 30, but you really need to graduate for this to make sense. And so if I say like, oh, among people who graduate, they earned X more a month, well, it's like, I'm now subsetting to the people who graduate, which is for 60% of people. And so we took this as a first piece of information that was nice and useful to be able to think about these issues, but I would largely agree. It would be great if we had a lot more power and randomize other features that people might care about. But yeah.
Maybe it's just a framing point, and so I'm getting hung up on something minor. But like, I don't know that I think of graduation rate as a measure of return on investment, which is I think how you set up the first part of the talk. In part because colleges and universities, in principle, can directly influence graduation rate through strategic decisions that may not connect to the return that students get from the degree. In a way that, like, looking at a student's earnings at 30, it's harder for colleges to influence that except through something more direct, I think, like investing in student actual human capital accumulation, or somehow strengthening the way that employers perceive the value of that particular degree. So I definitely see all the reasons that you're choosing this, and just more the framing of this as a measure of the ROI.
I think I agree with your point in some sense, but I also think colleges aren't doing that to the like I think the largest concern I would have is something like, I make the bar really low. I as a college can make the graduation rate high by making the bar really low. And I don't think that colleges are necessarily doing that. And I don't think that they're doing that as a function of their state funding. But I think that more generally, I think we agree on the standpoint that if you replace graduation rate with public college outputs, I think we're on the same page. And then the question is, what's a conceptualization of a public college output? And I would say graduates, right? Producing people with college degrees. And the rate is really nice because it's between 0 and 100. And it tells you something about all of the people who went through the system and tried the system, but didn't have that money go in vain in a way that the level of graduates would do if people had a lot more information. And it makes it harder to convey. So I'm gonna for sure agree that this is a quite imperfect conceptualization of the concept that we're interested in, but I do think it is conceptualization of the concept we're interested in.
The one final thought.
Yeah.
Definitely, I'll stop asking about this. There's no K-12 much better than I do, but my sense is as graduation rate as a measure of accountability in K-12 has increased, there are increasing concerns about how K-12 schools or districts are potentially manipulating that. And I think it may be worth thinking about potential parallels in how colleges, universities, my anecdotal sense from just the colleges and institutions I work with is that there are strategic ways that colleges do work to inflate graduation rates, independent of increasing investment in student learning. But again,
I'm going to also say we've collected this data, so I have this data. This is what I'm going to be able to tell you about. No, but I appreciate this point and concern. I'm gonna, I guess, move forward with this for
100% more. Just think as you're framing the paper or future talk.
I mean, would you say you don't think graduation rates are a measure of the outputs in some sense?
I'm
vote on it. But I wonder if it matters as much what one or two people can think about what is the right measure of ROI. Because what you're thinking about is perception. Right?
Yeah.
So as long as, well, not as long as, but I think if the individuals are conceptualizing graduation rate as a measure of ROI, then they can play with that for this particular exercise.
And I'll be able to show you some, well, I definitely have evidence of that. How much of it is in this presentation, we'll kind of see, but yes, okay. Okay, so how do we operationalize even this measure, taking it as face value, is we have individual and control group receive no information from us, but we elicit everyone's beliefs about the graduation rate, 0 to 100%, and its rank among states for all individuals, and then we provide a subset with either information about the graduation rate. So here's someone from our sample from Florida who thought that the graduation was 3% in the state. We tell them it's 69%, and so they see that there's a 16% difference. And then the bottom half, we see someone from California in our sample who receives analogous information about the graduation rate, but then also its rank among states. Okay, so now we want to measure the impact of our information on ideological polarization first. And so we conducted this in 2021, and so we're going to ask them after the COVID-19 pandemic has passed, how much do you think your state should spend per year at public four-year colleges? We also asked them a version of in the long run after COVID's weird. Oh, so we also asked them during COVID, how much do you think we should spend? Those are really highly correlated. And they're also within party highly correlated. If anything, Democrats are slightly more likely to think that COVID calls for less spending than Republicans do, which I found slightly surprising. But the levels are also different. Democrats want more spending. So, and then so this is gonna ask them what is your ideal spending, right? What is the point at which those two lines on the figures intersect? And then we're gonna try to measure their beliefs about return on investment as a function of the information. So we're gonna think about how they change their beliefs about spending when I tell you the graduation rate. Is it that you infer that spending was higher? Or is it something about your beliefs of productivity? We're going to elicit their policy beliefs. So for example, we're going to ask them given this change in spending, what do you think, if spending were to increase, what do you think would happen to the graduation rate? Or what do you think would happen to enrollment? And then we're going to ask some open-ended questions that are going to get us some information about how they reason as well. So we just want to measure affective polarization. So if part of the reason why Democrats and Republicans say fight or have distrust or dislike each other in the way that they talk about these policies is because of their beliefs. They think that they're really far apart on the policy spectrum, but maybe that's just because they had inaccurate beliefs. We may think that affecting ideological polarization could spill over and have important implications for affective polarization. That's an idea that I'd say has quite mixed evidence in the poli-sci literature with sort of cases of both yes, these are complements. And so to measure this, we're going to ask subjects if they would like to participate in a letter writing campaign to their elected officials. They could choose to write a single letter, but send that letter, or we'll send that letter on their behalf, to 5 state officials. So their governor, and then the majority and minority leaders of each party that's majority and minority, sorry, leaders of each of the state senate and the state house. So it's 5 total people. We're going to see who they choose to send a letter to, if anyone, or whether they even choose to write a letter. And then we're going to see what is the content of the letter. So we can see, did you write a positive letter? Did you write an angry letter? What sort of ideas did you express in that letter? And so we're going to say that if you reach across the aisle, so if I'm a Democrat who writes to a Republican with a letter that's positive in sentiment, then I'm going to have low affective polarization. And we really think that this is a nice measure of this concept because it is in large sense like revealed preference here. We're going to ask someone to spend time that they're being uncompensated for to engage in the policy process by writing a letter to their elected official, instead of just relying on sort of more stated preferences that have been used, like feeling thermometers, where you just ask people like, what do you think about Republicans, or what do you think about Democrats? And what's really nice about this measure is it has external relevance to the survey. So this isn't just where researchers asking you to tell us something. These are letters that are going to the representatives. And so we're going to then randomize the timing of when we send out these letters to be able to measure how elected officials respond to receiving information about from their constituents about their beliefs and feelings about higher education policy.
Are you using some like NLP method to measure sentiment?
Yes,
here?
I'm not. It's not by
Yeah, no, I'm just.
I will tell you that we have 4,700 people in this experiment. We have about 3,300 in our second experiment. We have about a 25% of people write a letter. I read through all of them about 5 times. It's incredibly depressing. Also very difficult to code, which we have tried. To understand like what they're writing about, like more content analysis, but like, yes, like for sentiment, I don't trust myself. Sebastian.
Do you know them who the governors or the Senate House leaders are in their parties?
We basically say like governor in your state, Republican, senator. We don't do the names. Yeah, I mean, so this is.
I'm curious about if people even know.
Yeah, so we're doing this on Qualtrics, which we don't know who they are until they like arrive. And so getting their congressional district, their state congressional district was concerning to us. So we asked it in this more open-ended way. We probably get more, I think we probably get more truthful intentions of who they want to see the message from this, because it's very obvious of like, who is your governor? Who is your Republican leader?
And did you ask them if they ever written a letter or email before?
Oh, no, we haven't. But that would have been nice. Okay, so now what did we find? So I want to start by just documenting a little bit about polarization with our sample. And so what we do is essentially conceptualize, sorry, Ben, our measure of return on investment here as whether or not you underestimate the ratio of the graduation rate divided by public spending per student. I mean, the idea of what we really want to say is something like, how many graduates did you get divided by how much did you spend to produce these graduates? So we essentially have the rate divided by the rate, and then links to the priors that we say. And we're going to say that we're just going to generate here an indicator if you underestimate the graduation rate. Sorry, this ratio is saying a proxy for you underestimated the return on investment.
I can't remember. Did you ask them what they thought the state spent?
Yes, and we asked them what they think is. We asked them. We start with their priors. So we have 4 priors that we measure. So we have 5 priors that we measure. We have in your state, what do you think is the level of graduation rate and spending? And then what do you think is the rank of graduation rate and spending? And then we say, what do you think the graduation rate is nationally in a level term? So we estimate this regression. We see that Republicans are much more likely to underestimate the return on investment. And this is entirely coming from the fact that they overestimate spending. So Republicans think that we're spending a lot on public colleges in our state, and we're getting the same amount of outputs by this measure that Democrats do. People on average are pretty close to being about right. So it's not that Democrats are, it's not that the level here is really off for Democrats on the graduation.
That's surprising to me, that they would be close to right. Is that right? Because there's just a bunch of people overestimating and equal number of people that are estimating.
Yeah, so
underestimating by
the
a
spread
lot.
is very large.
Okay.
It's just like on average, they're not that far from what the actual average is. We don't see really any other features really mattering here for being predictive of these, with the exception of people who follow college sports. I'm not going to overinterpret that. Okay, but we also find that so Republicans underestimate the return on investment, but we also find that they using our control group, they want lower levels of spending, and they also are more likely to write negative letters to Democrat officials, right? So this amount of or these beliefs about ROI in our control group are these correlated with these sort of other polarization measures that we may worry about. Yeah.
I actually don't have a great sense. What's the kind of within state heterogeneity in graduation rate across, like within 2 year? 2 year by state, 2 year by, or 4 year by state, the degree of heterogeneity in graduation rate.
Oh, so it's, I guess we're also really just telling them and focusing on 4-year colleges.
Oh, okay, so
because of how much local revenue, like state appropriations are pretty small for community colleges as a fraction of their revenue. And because of the localness of that issue,
Yeah.
doing it at the state level with the survey was sort of not feasible. So we tell them 4-year colleges.
okay. So same question. Then,
Yeah.
like heterogeneity within state across 4 years of graduation. What I'm wondering, just to provide context.
Yeah.
How much people are anchoring on like
The flagship.
whether what's salient for people is the state average or the 4 year that's appropriate. They're much more likely to go to. And if there's heterogeneity in graduation rate, I wonder if it's just thinking about looking at that as another subgroup measure, like something like being living in like in the bottom quartile in terms of like near a college that's further from the state average. I don't know. I have to think about how to. But I would think what's salient to people isn't the state; it's the one their family is more likely to go to as they think about graduation.
Yeah, I mean, so we elicit their priors and then we provide them with a specific piece of information, but we could. I'm just trying to think like what ex post we could then do to think about that. We don't. But it is large, but I want to say it's smaller than the prior of what people would think in Virginia. From the standpoint that a lot of states, even the flagship, has relatively low graduation rates. I'm going to pick out Maine as my always example here. Is the whole Maine system's quite homogeneous, surprisingly. Even the flagship in Maine has a graduation rate of 45%. Whereas you have other states like Virginia, where UVA is quite an exception. I mean, for public colleges in general, it's quite an exception. We could maybe categorize states by some measure of the within state variance and look at heterogeneity in that measure. But I think that's sort of the closest that we'd be able to get to that. I would say we also have looked at some measures of we know sort of where these people are, and we've looked at merging on information about colleges that are near them, and that doesn't seem to be driving some of our results, but we can do more. Okay, so now we're going to provide information. We're going to look at our treatment effects, and because these are randomized, we're just going to essentially present. We're just going to run a regression on 2 treatment indicators with a few controls, which sort of we have randomization. They don't super matter, but they're helpful for power. And so we're going to estimate this specification in a few ways. Each bar here is going to represent from a different specification, each set of bars, where people are going to appear in 3 of these sets. So first we have everyone on the far side. We're then going to do by party. So we're going to look at Republicans versus Democrats and Independents. We group Democrats and Independents together, and we pre-register, then we would group Democrats and Independents together, because there's a fair amount of literature on poli-sci that Republicans are always the different people in their responses. And so we're sort of following that in line. That does also seem to be consistent with what we find if we split Democrats and Independents together. And then we look between the elderly and the non-elderly. I think especially in the K-12 setting, this seems to be very important, although also true in the higher ed setting of I no longer have my kids in school, so I'm not going to pay for these services, and so I want a lot less in services. But not to say that the elderly don't benefit from having a high quality, robust set of social services in the state. Right. So we find that providing people I first actually want to just point out the control means. So these blue bars are the control means. Average state spending in appropriations is about $9,500. So everyone, even our Republicans in the control group, on average, want more than that. So I would say that that's sort of somewhat evidence of there being under provision, at least among the people who are in our sample, relative to what they want, their policy preference being what we actually see in the data. But then we sort of estimate, okay, what's the effect of providing this information? We see that on average, this increases the amount, information on average increases the amount of spending by about $600. That's, a non-significant amount compared to the control mean, non-insignificant amount. And this is really driven by Republicans and the elderly. So providing Democrats and independents with information and the non-elderly with information has like no effect, bigger effects for Republicans and the elderly. And this isn't driven by differences in their priors, right? I showed you on average, they have the same priors about the graduation rate. So they're receiving the same information, but they're responding differently. And so if we take these numbers together, we see that the partisan gap reduces by 32%, and the gap between the elderly and the non-elderly essentially completely goes away. So if I'm sort of alluding to that, I think this is, they're getting the same information, but they're reasoning differently. And so the first way that I want to show that is by splitting them out by their priors. So we're going to relook at the heterogeneity in responses by party, but we're going to then separate into people who learn good news that the outputs are higher versus bad news that the outputs are lower. So I underestimated the graduation rate. I thought it was 45, 60. We overestimated, thought it was 75, 60. And we see that these effects are entirely driven by Republicans who underestimated the graduation rate. So they get this good news that the outputs are higher, and now they're willing to spend more, or now they're at least saying that they want the ideal level of spending to be higher. A lot of this is movements away, but not all of it, is movements away from zero. So there's a lot of Republicans in our sample, not a lot. There's a non-negligible percent of Republicans in our sample who you ask them, should we spend money on higher ed? And they're like, no, absolutely none of my money should go to this. And this does seem to be fighting some of that. They're now more willing to at least support it by a positive amount. But everyone else seems to not respond. And so to us, this is somewhat of a puzzle. And we think that what this has to do is the way people are reasoning from this information about the return on investment. And so that's where we're going to turn to next. Yes.
We move on. The lowering of how much we should spend when you give them rank. Why is that?
Yeah. So a lot of this effect is because people's priors are poorly correlated. So I tell you that the graduation rate is higher, but then for a lot of these people, I also tell you that your work rank is worse.
And that happens more for Republicans than for Democrats?
No, it's just that Democrats and Republicans are non-responsive to information. So regardless of what I tell the Democrats and independents, they're not responding to the information, which is, show you where I'm going, it's consistent with them thinking that these are movements along these curves. But Republicans are in, like, the way that we've set this up is we really have 4 cuts. You can learn 2 pieces of good news, 1 piece of good news, 1 bad news, the other, and then 2 bad news. And here we're just showing you the cuts along the graduation rate dimension. And so everyone in this red bar is learning the graduation rate is higher. In this orange bar, they're learning the graduation rate is higher, but then like 30% of them are also learning that the state's actually ranked worse than they thought.
You're randomizing by state, right? It's not related to like
We're
more Republican.
Randomizing at the individual level.
So could this be driven by like more Republicans in a given state have lower rankings? Like yes, a given state, higher Republicans, but also lower ratings from the school. Or low.
I don't think it is.
Okay.
So these are also, we're providing information relative to their state. And so everything is here you could think of as like being first difference on what the state average is. And we're balanced on the state level. Okay, so we want to understand the extent to which like these differences in response information are driven by differences in reasoning. And so we're going to use a second experiment to test this mechanism. It's essentially the exact same thing as the first one, but we're going to measure their posterior beliefs about spending after the graduation rate. So if I tell you that this graduation rate was 15 percentage points higher, do you think spending changed, or do you think something else changed? in your beliefs? Is it that the state's more productive? Is it something that students who enroll are different? And then we're going to additionally randomize spending information itself. If it is in fact that people are learning about spending when we tell them something about the graduation rate, if I tell you both of those, it should sort of shut down that channel. And then we're gonna estimate these effects. We're gonna allow people to update differently based on their political affiliation and whether they learn the graduation rate or rank or higher or lower, sort of analogous to the results that I just showed you on the previous slide. And so, okay, so just so, again, before I show you the results, to re-motivate the goal of this exercise is our results so far are consistent with the idea that Democrats and independents, as well as Republicans who learn bad news, that outputs are actually lower in their state, fall into this camp, the movement along. I told them the graduation rate was higher or lower, and they just said, oh, it's because spending was different than I thought. There's nothing fun. I didn't fundamentally change my beliefs about state provision or cost effectiveness. It just changed my beliefs about where I think the state's actually doing. And our results are on Republicans who learn good news that graduation rate higher are in this camp, or would be consistent with this camp, where I told them the graduation rate is higher and they think it's my state's better at converting tax dollars into graduation rate. And so actually I think the state's more productive, and so I should actually want to spend more. The point at which, you know, my additional dollar to the government still matters, shifts out. Okay. So as a test of this, as I highlighted, we're going to estimate their change in their spending perception. So the difference between their thought after receiving the graduation rate minus their initial thought as a function of their party, so Republicans versus Democrats and independent, and then it's a linear spline in the graduation rate. So I'm going to motivate what this expression is really doing before I give you the results. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to be estimating a difference in differences here, where we're thinking about, or two differences in differences here, where what we're going to do is essentially compare people who learn the graduation rate is slightly higher, Democrats and independents who learn the graduation rate is slightly higher, to Democrats and independents who learn the graduation rate is much higher, compared to Republicans who learn the graduation rate is slightly higher, to Republicans who learn the graduation rate is much higher. And that's going to essentially set up a difference in differences, and then we're going to ask to what extent are people updating differently from this information by party. And what we find is among people who received this good news that the graduation rate is higher on this side of the figure, there is a quite stark partisan difference. And this line from Republicans is, you know, flat, or the point estimate is slightly positive, but it's not different than zero, which is to say Republicans, when we give them information about the graduation rate, are not learning about spending. They think spending is not changed at all. But Democrats think, oh, the graduation rate is higher because spending is higher. When we look at the other side of the figure, we look at people who learn bad news that graduations were lower, we see that the estimates for Republicans and Democrats are essentially exactly the same. And in fact, these slopes are not between Democrats over here and then Democrats and Republicans over here are not too different. So it's saying, regardless of good or bad news, those three of the four groups are basically just saying, yeah, the graduation rate change proportional to spending. And so we think of this as evidence, or that we think of this as essentially the mechanism that underlies our treatment effects, that these pessimistic Republicans are learning that the state is more productive and everyone else is learning about it. So to dig a little deeper into understanding how people think and reason about this, we're going to use some of the questions we ask, as well as the content of the letters that they send to their officials and some other open-ended responses that we ask to try to dig more into how they're reasoning. And so the first thing that I want to start with is comparing these pessimistic Republicans to everyone else and what they think the effective spending is. So we asked them, if the state were to spend a little bit more, how much do you think graduation rates would increase? And we see that compared to everyone else, these Republicans who underestimate the graduation rate are quite pessimistic about the effective spending. So they think money matters less. And so when you tell them that the graduation rate is higher, it's probably quite natural that they don't actually attribute this to the fact that the state's spending more. They don't think spending matters. So it would be sort of inconsistent for them to now say, oh, the reason graduation rates are higher is because the state is spending. We also find that these individuals are much more likely in their letters to write about waste in the system. So they're saying things like, our state is wasting dollars because all of these people are spending all this money on these kids who don't graduate. There's a lot of talk about how kids are going to college just to party and they're not actually getting anything out of their education. And then among people who receive the positive information, the graduation rate is higher, we see them being more likely to say things like, oh, wow, like the kids must be doing better than I thought. These kids are better than I thought. They're more worth it. And so I think this is, again, consistent with these ideas behind the mechanisms that there's these one group of people think that spending money in the system just generates a lot of waste and doesn't have a big effect on these outcomes, on these outputs, but we provide them information, those ideas sort of solve them. Not here, but in the paper, we have other information. I think this is a little to Ben's point, that it doesn't seem that that these responses or differences are due to differences in informativeness of the information. It's not about their priors. It's not about the locations that they live and differences in the systems from where they live. And we check a few other.
You've broken this down by Republicans with and without college degree. I'm just thinking, I'm sort of thinking about the blocks of Republicans in my head. And so there's some like wealthy, sort of pro-business Republicans who I'm sort of putting in the perhaps may overestimate the graduation rate, but are still nonetheless like supportive of higher ed, with a contingent of not college educated, sort of the disaffected working class.
Yeah, we haven't done this figure by that, although, I mean, I can tell you just from the regression from before, being college educated has minimal effects on their prior, some groups that they fall into, but that's not to say that's not true conditional being a Republican, which is not something I don't know off the top of my head whether or not that's true, because obviously the selection by the selection into being college educated by party is also different. So that may be true, but I'm not sure, and we can look into that. So now, in the last few minutes before Q&A, I just want to turn. I want to turn to effective polarization briefly, and I'll show you what happens when we send these letters. So let me look at the treatment effects by whether or not they send a positive, on whether or not they send a positive letter across the aisle. So I'm a Democrat who sent a positive letter to a Republican, and we again find, effects of information that are especially driven by Republicans and self-identified or strong partisans, but especially self-identified strong Republicans. So this is consistent with this idea that information that leads people to moderate in their beliefs is also leading them to be more likely to reach across the aisle and have positive interactions with people of the other party, which I think is maybe a positive takeaway that overall, combining these sort of two experiments, it seems that a lot of the polarization and sort of negative interactions across people is likely not, or perhaps not, driven by just like irreconcilable differences in taste, but is driven by differences in perceptions that could potentially be fixed. Okay, so in the last -1 minute that I have before Q&A, I want to just talk to you about what happens when we send out these letters. So we randomize the timing of when 240 elected officials receive these constituent letters. We have people from every state. We have too few letters from the Dakotas, so we end up dropping them. And then Nebraska only has one state chamber, so you can't send to Senate and House. That gives us 240 people. We randomize 50% to receive a letter with information about the experiment, the results on policy preferences, and then their constituent demands. So essentially like a PDF that had all of the comments and from the letters that they received or were intended for them. 25% just receive an email from us because that's going to be sort of a logical baseline to compare against receiving an email on the outcomes that we think we're able to move. And then 25% receive nothing from us. And so then we're going to measure how receiving this contact from us affects the elected officials' engagement in higher education issues. So we include a proposed resolution that we wrote up about maintaining state funding in their state. We look if they click on this link. We look at whether or not they respond to our emails. And we look if they set a meeting to meet with us. Ben.
Good question. Can you just clarify, like, for a given one of these 240 representatives, how many letters they got?
50.
They each got 50. That's like based on the share of the experimental sample that elected to write letters.
Yeah.
Okay, and 50 So the 50% that are getting them in the year 2023 get a batch of 50 letters over a fairly.
Oh,
Are you sending them
in
like
once.
you send like a big manila envelope with here 50
Oh,
letters.
it's by email, but yes.
Okay, but like 50 letters from your constituents.
Yeah.
And then again, like the data is the data, but like whether these are measures of engagement on higher education, or whether what you have here are like pro forma constituent response that would be true on any issue. Like, meaning they respond to every email they get because that's what they do. They set meetings, or they offer to set meetings.
I agree. I was more hopeful before running it that we were going to be able to disentangle those. And I think we got less engagement on things like meeting with us. That was going to be helpful. That was going to be helpful for us to really understand that. But this is why we have this second treatment, which is a generic email with some information, but not the constituent letters. Because we're trying to basically get people who would, we're trying to have a comparison group, which is people, right? So the no contact one would have been great if we could like move policy and we could compare people who got this versus people who absolutely got this and look at policy, but we're not moving policy, unfortunately. And so really, I think this is the relevant control group of people who receive a generic, not generic, because it has a lot of information about the study and nationally what people want from their higher education funding. But yeah. Okay, so what do we find? So we find, so again, things are randomized, so we're gonna estimate the effects of receiving just the contact only, and then also receiving these letters as well as the contact only, the contact. And we see that among all elected officials, but especially among Republicans, receiving information about your constituents increases their engagement. So the likelihood that they're gonna click on this resolution. We also, for Republicans, we're more likely to get a response when it had the constituent letters than when not having constituent letters. No effects on meeting with us. We actually only met with like 3 elected officials. It was a very interesting, I guess, too much on how the sausage is made here, but we met with South Carolina and they only met with us because someone from South Carolina, because it was like, oh, an economist from Chicago emailed me. That sounds fun. But I hope we were helpful for the state. We also met with the state of Wisconsin, which was actually in our contact only group. And I think that was a quite interesting but sobering meeting. Okay, so I'm over time, so I'm going to stop there and of course, open up the floor for any remaining questions.
Andrew, I'm curious, in thinking about how the respondents thought about the investment, like framing that seems challenging. I can imagine, like the way you did it was just say how many $1,000s should the state be spending. But I could also imagine you say like the average taxpayer in your state pays this much towards higher education, or you could imagine saying this fraction of the state budget goes towards higher education. How did you decide on the one you did versus those other sort of ways to frame the spending? Or do you think it matters?
Oh, so I want to clarify something before this is like we never say anything about like investment to them.
Yeah.
Right. This is like an ex post. We're trying to understand how these people.
The amount spent.
Okay, so our focus on appropriations per student was, it seemed to be the policy relevant metric that we could most easily elicit, or that to us made sense to elicit beliefs about. And other issues, I think, run into the denominator problem of money per person or other things like that. I think that people don't have a good understanding of what the number of people there is and what the size of the system is. And for us, not saying that we got it right, but for us in trying to think about how to think about what people would understand per student seems very natural, because a lot of quantities that you're experienced with are per student. When we talk about funding per student in K-12 in particular, or we talk about like tuition, which is per student, Those are all sort of ballparks that we thought people would have more of a sense to be able to base it around. And then because of that, they'd have stronger beliefs coming in about what is a reasonable number. And I don't even know if I, like, as a tax economist, I'm like great at being like, what should tax revenue per person be in the state for a given issue? I think that that's more difficult, but I'm happy to concede that that may not be true in reality.
Can you talk a little bit more about what you think about the sort of the external validity of your underlying model of polarization and driving people's sort of attitudes to, or driving spending towards higher ed, right? So one thought that occurs to me is that over the last, like you showed us that figure at the beginning of the talk about appropriations, changes in spending, and over the last 20 years or so, like people's attitudes towards higher ed has really changed a lot. And so I guess what I'm wondering is like,
Yeah, I mean,
do these results inform what happened between, you know, in the early 2000s? Because that seems like that could, like the underlying data generating model could be very different there, or maybe Republicans were not as partisan on this specific issue as that. I don't know. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I'm willing to concede that this curve, this downward sloping curve, has been very different by party over time, right? That, I mean, I use DEI as the example, but I think there's a bunch of other reasons why people's perceptions about the value of public higher education, in some sense, the perception of the value of going to college has also changed quite dramatically over time, and is likely changed by party. We view this exercise and what we've done here as saying that people's beliefs about the value of higher education and the return on investment, or like the bang per buck, say, is important for driving their beliefs. There's a bunch of reasons why that return has declined. The reason that I sort of started with, or that's highlighted in the paper I started with by Sarah and co-authors, is that there's a lot of more out-migration, and that's affected the return on investment. There's maybe changes in the labor market, differences in the college wage premium that affect the return on investment. There's a lot of sort of ways to say, or what I think we do well in the confines of this experiment is showing that differences in how people think and reason about this. There are differences in how people, by their partisanship, think and reason about the return on investment for higher education, and those seem to matter for what they're willing to support. There's a lot of ways to conceptualize this, to Ben's point, and I think that we use one example to think about this component of the return on investment, the extent to which they also think about those things for labor market outcomes or others is like, I can't necessarily touch on, but I would be cautiously optimistic to say that these beliefs about this bang per buck or cost effectiveness issue seem to matter more generally. I don't have data to be able to say that it's like a fundamental problem of external validity here, but.
So you touched on this a little bit, the zeros. So I'm wondering about the folks who the prior their G star is at 0.
Yeah.
You said there's a fair number of them.
It's like 3%. No, it's like 3% of people. It's maybe 6% of Republicans or something like that. But they're not. So our like causal effects of providing information are. I'm not sure. It's been a while since I looked at it specifically. Are partially driven by movements away from 0, but also partially driven by movements positive conditional being above 0. Well, like we don't have a within design, so we can't really disentangle that too easily. I just was surprised also by we're affecting not only like people's beliefs about what you should spend, but we're also along the distribution, but we're also affecting what I would call extreme polarization. Polarization among the people who have the lowest demand for.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting group, but here I'm trying to think about how could you even, like, what is their marginal cost, perceived marginal cost curve? Well, it's because it's not sloping upward. Right?
Oh, I mean, there,
or it's
no, that could be about their perceived marginal benefits. So they think the value of investing in public colleges is is so low that they even want to tax colleges. Like, I think colleges are net bad on society. We should actually tax their endowments instead of giving them state subsidies. But that would be that sort of thing.
What was the incentive to respond to the survey?
We paid them. So a standard like Qualtrics survey where they recruit for you and we pay them to participate. And then there was no incentive to, like, you have a higher effective wage rate if you don't write a letter, because you're not going to spend time engaging with your elected officials. That's what I think makes it a nice revealed preference measure of you're spending your uncompensated time to engage in the political system.
Had elderly versus not elderly, and I'm wondering, you made a statement about the rationale of like, people
Yeah.
have kids in the system versus don't, they feel differently. Did you have information on whether or not they had kids in the system or whether they had children previously?
We do. So we asked them about both their engagement with the system, their kids' engagement with the system, and their expected engagement for their kids in the system in the future. Because some people have too young kids or maybe don't have kids yet. And I am trying to remember what we find. Part of the issue is that those aren't that correlated with your political ideology in the same way. I mean, Republicans are largely, elderly are largely Republican, although not, our results on Republicans also hold for the non-elderly sample, independently for the elderly and non-elderly sample.
Sorry, you may have said this, but are you looking at whether the effects vary depending on how people are accurate or inaccurate about spending levels? Like, how
So,
does that
yeah.
intersect with? It feels like it's a multi-dimensional.
Yes, so in the interest of time, that was, okay, it's somewhere in the appendix slides. So what we do in our second experiment is we jointly randomize graduation information and spending information. Among people who get graduation information, we get their posteriors and spending, but then we also have people who receive both graduation information and spending information. And so from that, we can say like, okay, we're going to stop these Republicans from not appropriately correcting about the graduation rate and then see what happens. But I think we've talked about this before. It's a little hard when you give people spending information and then ask them how much do they want to spend, because you anchor them. So we also have a room just give them spending information, and the patterns are broadly consistent with this, which is that these Republicans didn't correct enough. You now tell them spending's higher. They have a less positive impression of the system, and then they end up wanting lower spending than if you just gave them the graduation information by itself. But one way to say that is this 32% partisan reduction gap is too much. And the reason is that we tell these Republicans the graduation rate is higher. They don't think spending changed, and they should have. Because like there is effective spending on graduation. And so when they believe that spending is relatively fixed, they now think the cost effectiveness is actually better than it is. So they overshoot the goal. And then providing spending information stops them from overshooting the goal. They have less optimistic beliefs about this cost effectiveness. And so they actually want less than when you just tell them graduation.
This just might be me not understanding this, but the effect is that marginal costs are shifting back.
Yeah, so it's
I'm just taking Brendan's question of like, who are these Republicans in the sample? And just with people having like wildly different marginal benefit curves. And I just wonder how that's kind of controlled for in this, or it's not a confounding factor.
in what sense?
I might just not make sense, but it's like, it just seems like a lot of people like the benefit like they're marginal benefit for in terms of graduation rate, which is like a constant 0.
Oh, but so the value of randomization here is that I'm gonna take 3 people with the exact same marginal benefit and marginal cost curves at the start. One of them I'm gonna do nothing with. One of them is gonna learn the graduation rate. One of them is gonna learn the graduation rate. I mean, I think like the heterogeneity is interesting and important. And understanding the extent to which these people are fundamentally different is interesting. But because it's a between design, I can't identify these like 0 people in my treatment group in the same way I can identify these 0 people in my control group. So I can't like condition on you said 0 because the treatment is going to affect the set of people who said 0, but it's not going to affect my ability to like estimate among baseline characteristics heterogeneity in treatment effects.
So in your rigor of the letters and like looking at the sentiment and whether you wrote positive letters sort of across the aisle, I wonder if you had like conceptualized any other ways to like, because that would only account for Republicans writing positive letters to Democrats, and I'm wondering if
Other way too.
the other way, right? The Democrat, right? And Democrats writing positive letters to Republicans, but are there like, have you thought about any way to measure Republicans writing positive letters to Republicans about higher, like you know what I mean, like them encouraging their own representatives who maybe they voted for and saying like, I voted for you.
Yes.
I want you to do this.
I see. So
That'd be hard to measure just with like the sentiment. So I get why you did it, but I'm just wondering.
Yeah. No, I mean, we've done it in some sense. Like we've looked at, I don't have them here. We've looked at the effects of writing a letter to your own party. And one interpretation I have of our overall results is that we induced a few more people to write letters. We induced a fair number of people to write letters, and then among the people we induced to write letters, they were now willing to both send it to their own party and now also reach across the aisle. Not necessarily as much that we induce people to, that plus people who already wrote a letter, we now induce them to be willing to share the letter also with people of a different party, but not so much, or those are the 2 sort of effects that I think we're picking up on. Not as much changes in only writing a letter to your own party. Great, thank you very much. I'm here, so